Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, joined by the reporter who's made a career out of crossing the divide, Jessica Stone. You see what I did there, Jess? How you doing?
You're hilarious. Bring it.
All right. And as always, if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a shout on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Linda Feldmann is Washington bureau chief at the Christian Science Monitor and is their senior political and White House correspondent. She's also someone adept at crossing the divide, as she worked at the Moscow News for a brief time as part of the first U.S.-Soviet journalists exchange, and has since served as a journalist as the Moscow bureau chief for the Christian Science Monitor, and has even been part of diplomatic efforts through the Dartmouth Conference. She's won numerous awards and honors for her work and was elected to the Gridiron Club, which means our guest today is pretty much a badass journalist. One of the best. Linda Feldmann, this is such an honor. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Well, thank you for having me. This is a great way to spend an evening.
Yeah. Well, it's still early here, and we're on separate coasts, so this is kind of cool. We're crossing the divide as we speak.
Look at you. It's the transatlantic divide.
Fantastic. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I saw, Linda, that you grew up in the Boston area.
Right. Yeah, I'm from Winchester, Massachusetts, and in fact, here's a fun fact: I share a hometown with Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Ooh.
And one of the things I do for the Monitor is host newsmaker breakfasts. And before everything shut down for the pandemic, I was hot on the trail of trying to get General Milley to appear at a Monitor breakfast. And then, of course, everything shut down. But so we're almost the same age. And as I said, we grew up in the same town. My mother still lives in Winchester. He, I think, still has family there. So when everything springs back to life, I'm going to be back on that trail trying to get Mark Milley. I know he's a very sociable guy, I'm told. I have spies in the Pentagon who think he might actually do this. So
wow. Since you brought it up, could you share? You have a number of endeavors where you're bringing voices from across the spectrum together, including the Monitor Breakfast. I mentioned the Dartmouth Conference. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Monitor Breakfast?
The Monitor Breakfast is something that started in the mid 1960s. And I wasn't the one who started it. I'm not that old. It was started by a guy named Godfrey Sperling, better known as Budge Sperling. Budge did it. He did it forever. He did it for like 35 years, way into his 80s. Handed off to a guy named Dave Cook, and then I picked it up from Dave about 3 years ago. Basically, what it is it's the original Power Breakfast. So we invite somebody, a prominent, a cabinet member, or a prominent member of Congress, or head of the AFL-CIO, whoever, and have them come and sit around a table with a bunch of reporters. And the signature trait of these breakfasts is civility. So so much of Washington, especially now, is just based on toxicity and gotcha questions and attacks. And we're kind of old school. I mean, our breakfasts over the years have made a lot of news.
Yeah.
There was the famous crybaby incident with Newt Gingrich. We had Ed Rollins, who made the comments about walking around money in an election that he was managing. But that's on them. What happens is people will come to our breakfast and they'll get very relaxed, and then they'll start talking. This hasn't happened recently, But those are sort of exceptions. The main thing is just to have a civil conversation and get to know these people as people. There is in journalism, journalists and sources are in some ways, and journalists and public figures, there's by definition, an adversarial relationship. We're covering them, like it or not. Donald Trump loved the press until he hated us, right? I mean, Jessica knows this well. He loved us because we paid attention to him 24/7.
Yeah.
But then if somebody, unearthed something embarrassing or unflattering, then he was very unhappy with us. So, but the main thing with these breakfasts is just to have a conversation and get away from sound bites and really dig in on subjects and keep it civil.
That's a terrible idea. I'm vehemently opposed to civility.
I would just add too that the times I've been there, I thought of it also as a really great opportunity for cub reporters or people that don't know other members of the press corps to learn from each other and to see what kinds of questions. There's just so many different kinds of stories that come out of these, and so you kind of watch people and their angles, and you can learn a lot. Plus, the pastries are pretty good.
Yeah. And another nice thing about it is that I had a couple of years ago, I had Nancy Pelosi. And, if you're a small outlet, if you're like from a regional newspaper, your ability to interact with Nancy Pelosi one-on-one, the Speaker of the House, it's pretty slim chance that'll happen. But if you've got a group of you around a table, then everybody can ask a question. And these breakfasts start by, I walk the guest around the table, everybody, shakes hands. It's a nice way to start. It sort of sets things off in a direction of, we're all people, we're all human beings. I think people sometimes forget that in Washington. There's this kind of almost play acting that goes on where you've got, everybody's enemies and they're trying to get them somehow.
So since you bring it up, I think you're right. I think that there's this thing where there used to be an understanding where, okay, I'm wearing the politics hat on now, but once we get to legislating, we can be we can be civil and have disagreements and come from different positions. But when I'm in front of the mics, I'm going to be wearing the other hat. So you understand that, but folks seem to have forgotten those roles. And then the roles that they're putting a certain hat on, they become the person. And it reminds me of something that Dostoevsky talked about, which I want to ask you about. He said that
was a nice segue, Cor.
Right? He said that at one point he was talking about the arts. He said, we're in a stage now where it used to be that art imitates life. Now we're in a place where I'm seeing that life imitates art. And this is a very loose translation of what he said. And he said, I look into the future and I think that we may get to a time where life derives its very meaning of existence from the arts. So it's interesting that he was pretty prescient. All that as a segue to say, so you studied Russian language and literature. Were you studying Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov in the original Russian? I'm so curious.
So I studied at Middlebury College, which is famous for its language programs. And I did grind away really hard at learning Russian, but I'm not going to claim that I read, Crime and Punishment or Anna Karenina in Russian. I read those in English. We were assigned to read shorter stories, Chekhov, Gogol, Turgenev. We read Pushkin. We read, the poetry of Pushkin in Russian. But no, I didn't read War and Peace in Russian.
So Jess, I never told you this. Did I tell you that I produced Three Sisters, and it was a really, really special piece. And it was a theater, if there were 25 seats in this particular theater, but it was such a special production. We had a fellow who was with Carnegie Mellon, studied at the Moscow Art Theater through an exchange. And he did an original translation of Three Sisters for us.
Wow.
And it just so happened that the director, a lot of folks don't know, Christian Bale's younger sister, Louise Bale, is a brilliant, brilliant person. She was the director and just did this great, but I have an affinity at Chekhov and some of my favorite literature is the Russian, 1800s.
That makes sense now that I think about it. There's a depth there that I think would draw you in.
Yeah. So in all seriousness, why were you drawn to that course of study at Middlebury?
It's through Russian culture. I know as a child, my parents had record albums. This is back in the day when you had vinyl record albums of Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky, and the record albums were beautiful Russian folk art. And I remember, as a 7-year-old sitting and staring at it and thinking it was just very romantic and exotic and beautiful. And I've always liked languages. So when I arrived at Middlebury, I was deciding between Russian and Chinese, and I just felt Russian was a little more accessible. I mean, they have an alphabet. It's not pictograms like in Chinese. So, and then
ain't no one learning that one easily. I can attest to that.
So my son studied Chinese. My son speaks Thai and Chinese and Khmer. So that's his deal. I stick with Russian, which, learning the Cyrillic alphabet isn't all that hard. It's just different letters, and you just learn the sounds. It takes, a few days. But it's just a beautiful language. I just love it.
So you spent a considerable amount of time overseas, stints in Moscow, the Middle East, as well as reporting you've done at the UN and as a foreign affairs correspondent. You can certainly be considered, I think you had mentioned, I forgot where I saw it, globally minded in your work.
Right.
Even with your graduate work, international public policy at Johns Hopkins. How does that inform the stories that you focus on?
I guess I look at everything. I sort of imagine the people that I know from other countries and other cultures, and what not just what would Americans want to know, but how would this make sense, say, to a friend in Russia or a friend in Thailand, to sort of draw back. I mean, the Monitor likes to look at things through a very wide lens, and when I write about international topics, I feel that the goal is to really draw out the humanity. I mean, the Monitor does this in all of our coverage, whether it's a domestic topic or international. But, cultural differences are fascinating and wonderful and to be celebrated, but there are the common threads of humanity that draw throughout the globe. And as Jessica knows well, that's what makes being an international reporter so wonderful, is you can go to some country that might feel very exotic and unusual at first, and then the minute you start talking to people, the differences just melt away. And I hope that comes through in my coverage.
Yeah, it's certainly the most recent one that we want to talk a great deal about. You really humanized everyone that you referred to, whether it was a pastor or an activist or just the different folks that you referenced. They came across as human beings, and they were from a wide swath of people that you wouldn't necessarily put together in the same story. So it was really, I thought that came across really effectively. So just to expound on that a bit, how might that be different from journalists who've been strictly stateside their whole careers?
Well, just in general, I think it's important for people to understand that news is people. So the President of the United States is a human being, right? I mean, he, and it's always been a he, is on the news every day. You see their image everywhere, and it's easy to lose sight of the fact that he is a human being. And the same is true of everybody you talk to, whether it's an academic or a homeless person or just, some other, a historian, just anybody they bring their life experience and their perspectives to their work and to whatever the story is that you're writing. And so when I wrote this story about politics, looking at whether politics has become a form of religion, my observation in surveying the articles that had already been written on this subject was that they didn't include real people in them, and that religion is just a profoundly and fundamentally human subject. And so it's fascinating. I mean, and you talking about religion and politics without killing each other. I was on the verge of killing myself writing this story because it's there's so many angles and so many different avenues. I mean, you can just go on forever. But my observation was that that there weren't a lot of real people being discussed. A lot of people have written about this subject through their own personal lens. So I mentioned Andrew Sullivan in the article. He's written on this subject a number of times. He is a devout Roman Catholic. He's also gay, which that creates an interesting tension right there. And he, so from his perspective as a religious person, he can't understand, he thinks everybody has to have a religion. Whether even if you're an atheist, that atheism itself is a religion. And he refers to other people. Somebody's written a book on the God gene, so that everybody that
there's a God-sized hole.
The God-sized hole, Blaise Pascal, which I love that. This is not to say that everybody consciously believes in God, but that you have to believe in something outside of yourself, that you can't just be this completely self-contained entity. So I feel like this article was about 3,000 words. I feel like I just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. Let me just back up and let everybody know the title of the article is called Is Politics the New Religion? It was just released this past week in the Christian Science Monitor. And it's about a 12-minute read. It's worth every minute and then some, because you will want to go down the rabbit trails of all of her sources. It's very thoroughly researched. How long did it take you to report this out?
It took me about 6 weeks.
Gosh.
But that wasn't like 6 weeks full time. I mean, I had, for example, Jessica, you'll appreciate this. I had White House pool duty in the middle of that in Wilmington. So, Joe Biden goes home to Wilmington a lot. And our turn for travel pool came up. So off I went to Wilmington for a weekend in the middle of all of this. And I had to write a few other things in the meantime. So I kept having to put it to the side and let it marinate and do another story and then come back to it, which can be frustrating. I mean, there's an upside and a downside to operating that way, because sometimes when you let a subject sit, you can keep collecting string. So I'm constantly reading, or my editor sees things and she's sending me more things. And I mean, at a certain point, I almost had to tell her to stop, because it can go, you can just sort of drown in other articles and in people's comments, or even just watching cable news. Somebody made reference to on Twitter, watching Rachel Maddow was like a holy experience. So you get on those evening shows, you've got, Sean Hannity, and Rachel Maddow, and their followers are almost like acolytes. I mean, so they inspire worship.
Yeah.
And you see that people will tweet while they're on the air, and they'll tweet religious imagery relevant to what they're talking about. So it that definitely fed.
I don't think I quite knew that piece of information. That's pretty intense. Well, I discovered your article because you put it on Facebook with the following introduction. You said, maybe the hardest story I've ever written. Religious participation in the US has sunk dramatically since 2000, while political polarization only gets worse. Are the two connected? I refuse to say that, and I'll ask you about that in a little while, but it's easy to conclude that for some people, politics has become a quasi-religion. Why was this the hardest you've ever written, or maybe one of the hardest you've ever written articles?
So, first of all, I have no background in religious studies. I didn't take any religion classes in college. I don't have any particular background in theology. So I had to, and it's such a rich topic. I mean, I read somewhere that there are 10,000 identified religions in the world. And understanding what they all, I mean, I didn't try to unpack that in particular. It's just, I would definitely kill myself. But just even going through, I mean, there's no way you can sort of understand what it all means. And it isn't even required. What was hard about this article was the temptation that I've seen by some people to draw a causal link between the decline in religious participation, which Gallup recently measured at, membership in a religious congregation, whether it's a church or a mosque or a synagogue, is now below 50% for the first time in 8 decades of polling by Gallup. So I think it was in 1999, it was 70% of Americans belonged to some congregation. We're now at 47%. That's massive. That's really dramatic. Yeah. And at the same time, we've seen our politics become incredibly polarized. I've been in Washington over 30 years. And I remember, I mean, you talk about people from the other side of the aisle, they can fight like cats and dogs in Congress, and then after hours go out and have a beer together, like Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. That doesn't happen anymore. So the temptation is to draw a causal link, but as anybody in social science knows, correlation is not causation. I mean, we've had past eras of tremendous upheaval in this country. We had the Civil War. We had the civil rights upheaval of the 50s and 60s. We had assassinations. We had riots in the streets. But in the 60s, religious participation was quite high. People really did go to church or synagogue or what have you. So I'm not sure I agree that the political upheaval that we're seeing right now is linked to a decline of religiosity in this country. But I reserve the possibility that it is true. I just don't know how you can prove that. And this is something that I learned from talking to all these people for this article, is that you can take lots and lots of polls, which will give you the what, but they don't tell you the why. And I would ask, you always want to ask a pollster, why is this happening? And they'll give you a bunch of theories, but they don't want to go outside the data. They'll just say, this is what we're seeing in the data, decline in belief in God. One of the main sources for this article was a professor named Ryan Burge, who was fantastic. He just wrote a book called The Nuns.
Yeah, we want to have him on. He sounds like a really fascinating guy. He would be great,
really interesting. And he's also a Baptist pastor.
Okay.
So he has a rooting interest in this topic. And in fact, he says he got his PhD. He saw, as a pastor, the decline in religious participation and wanted to understand what that was about. And so he went to school to study that.
Yeah, so some of the reference material that you cite in the piece is definitely quantitative. Some is a little bit more qualitative, or at least the resources from the references of the references are certainly qualitative. I was wondering if you did come across folks that at least theorized whether the politicization of many church communities or houses of worship as a reason for folks becoming disengaged. I know in our family, all 3 of my kids have different levels of belief, and they went to hardcore Christian school, private school for the better part of 10 years. For the first 10 years after I became a Christian, it was a evangelical Baptist church. But once they all got to a certain age and started thinking independently, the community was more primarily defined by certain socio-political leanings than what they were actually reading in their Bible. And in all 3 cases, at the very least, it created a level of maybe not cynicism, but certainly skepticism about it. I was wondering if you came across anything like that as well.
Definitely. I mean, it's true, especially with the major evangelical churches. They've definitely sorted by politics. I talked to somebody for a different story who had actually was a Donald Trump supporter in 2016, and then over time drew away from Donald Trump, was unhappy about treatment of children at the border, and disavowed Donald Trump, and he had to switch to a different church because the church he was at was so thoroughly pro-Trump. And this is, I think, for large denominations, this is definitely the case. And I mentioned this in this article about people having to move to a different church to align with their politics. I mean, it's tricky for churches because they're not allowed to overtly endorse candidates. I mean, that's a violation. That's a tax violation. They could get in trouble with the IRS for doing that. But we all know that churches can informally, they can have activism around issues, even if it isn't overtly around particular candidates. And some churches, I have, I know people who are very active in Unitarian churches, and their main, it strikes me that their main form of church activity is social activism. That is that, and in fact, one of them, after she read my article, she wrote to me and she said, her big issue is climate change, and she said that when she had a success on climate change, getting their member of Congress to sign on to a particular initiative, she said she felt the same kind of religious high that she gets from going to church.
Wow.
So that really for her, the church and politics really did merge at that moment. So anyway, I guess that's.
Yeah, Jess, I didn't tell you we're going to be inviting the pastor of our church. He wrote a volume called God is Undocumented. So he's pretty explicitly political, but in more of a biblically sound way, I think. Okay. So anyway, sorry.
That sounds exciting.
But you also talked about your children, and this is another really interesting point about this topic, which is that you get young people who were oftentimes raised in a particular faith tradition, which either going to church or going to synagogue or what have you, and then for a variety of reasons might pull away completely, become an atheist. I know young people who were raised in a particular faith who are now atheists, and atheism and agnosticism is definitely on the rise, particularly among young people. And atheists are the most active, quote, religious group in the country. They're only 6% of the population, but I think the statistic is that about 28% annually are involved in some kind of political action. That's the highest of any, quote, religious group.
That's interesting.
But I think for young people, you also see a pulling away from religion over LGBTQ issues, over treatment of women. I mean, one of the moments in this article,
environment, it's in some cases too.
And climate change. Yeah. The trend in the Black church was just stunning to me, that young Black people are moving away from church just as much as young white people are, young adults. And I only had literally 2 paragraphs about that in my story. I mean, that's just a huge topic. And as someone pointed out, Black Lives Matter did not spring from the Black church in the way that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s did. So we had, obviously Martin Luther King was the iconic figure of the civil rights movement. And today you have Black Lives Matter, which there are Black pastors involved in politics. You've got Senator Warnock from Georgia, who was the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. You have the Reverend William Barber in North Carolina, very active in the racial justice movement, but you also have very strong non-religious Black involvement. And that's, I think I'll probably follow up on that at some point.
Well, I was going to bring that up, so maybe we'll have some fodder for your article here. You wrote about that particularly, quote, between 2008 and 2020, religious disaffiliation among African Americans soared from 17.7% to almost 35%, so really double, according to the Harvard study, which you quote pretty extensively throughout the article. At the risk of asking you to make some conclusions, I'm just wondering if you see any correlation between this trend and whether there would be a similar appetite for peaceful protest. Is, one of the things that strikes me about Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement is that between the teachings of Gandhi and the teachings of the church, there was obviously a big focus on peaceful protest and sort of being forced into a violent posture. Whereas I don't know if you can make that same argument about some of the other protests that have taken place. And I don't know if there's a religious piece in there that sort of speaks to motivation. But do you have any insights or questions even about where it takes the Black activist movement with respect to BLM and other sort of racial activism movements in that respect?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak without having done my research on this. I know there are Black religious people who are very involved in BLM. I mean, even something as simple as during the protests of last summer, if the church is located on the way to a protest site or at a protest site, people sitting outside the church, giving out water, giving out food, supporting the protesters, supporting nonviolent protest for sure. That is for sure an important element of what has happened with the movement for racial justice. But then there is a component that is not based in religion.
I think we just have to say BLM in and of itself, not its right. BLM itself is a Marxist movement. Its underpinnings are, but there are certainly people who subscribe to the cause that would not be described that way.
Exactly. No, BLM does self-identify as Marxist, and Marxists generally don't believe in God. Anyway, I don't know if that's completely true. I mean, some people might view themselves as Marxist for economic reasons, and then they might have a spiritual side to them. I mean, one of the things I didn't even get to in my article is people who identify as spiritual but not religious, which is a phrase that has been around for decades and is a growing, people increasingly self-identify that way, that somehow religion for some people has a negative connotation, that you're somehow a sheep if you follow religion. I mean, remember Barack Obama, when he was running for president the first
clinging
time,
to your religion and guns,
right? To your religion and guns. And we know how he feels about guns, and it was not a flattering,
right.
I don't think he was meaning to be flattering toward religion when he said that. So it's.
Well, I mean, I don't even identify as a religious person. I don't describe myself that way, because I do think, I mean, wouldn't you say so, Cor? There's like, even in certain parts of churches, there's a hesitancy to identify as a religious person because it's associated with rules and rule following and just that and sort of letter of the law, not spirit of the law. For me anyway.
Yeah, and can be associated with intolerance.
Sure.
So it cuts both ways, and I think sometimes if a person identifies as religious, they have to kind of explain themselves and maybe be reassuring that they're not intolerant or that they're not proselytizing. I think some people are afraid of religious people whose faith wants them to convert people to that faith.
Yeah. I think that a lot of that aversion comes from the connotations that have been assigned to the word religion. There's something that, when I get past the rhetoric about it, is deeply meaningful to me. As a kid, I remember the first words of the invitation to my bar mitzvah were, "As my father and grandfather before me." Indicating that I was connected to a history and a people, and there are certain aspects of rituals that are very, very meaningful, that as a Christian now, as I take this bread and I take this wine, that I'm connecting to a practice that's been happening for now thousands of years. So I wonder I'm a little torn about some of the movements that we see, while on the one hand, I'm very, very encouraged about the need to move social justice forward. There are great ills in our culture that we need to address as a culture. And yet a lot of the prevailing thought and prevailing dispositions even don't necessarily have a transcendent philosophical mooring. I want to know, for example, just generally like, what are the mores here? And I'm afraid that the mores are dictated by, somebody who has enough followers on Twitter, what they're, how they feel that day. That somehow doesn't seem as authoritative or deeply rooted as stuff that's been that's tried the test of time.
Yeah. No, and that's where I think politics and sort of the everyday activism, or even just posting ideas on Twitter, where that can't be religion. I mean, as I think Ryan Burge had a comment that politics, here's what he said: politics doesn't have the legs that religion does, which carries you through all parts of your life. That there's something that
cradle to grave kind of.
Yeah, that it's the transcendent aspect of religion that I think politics can't possibly supplant.
So being the Jew that I am, I'm still a Jew, even though I'm a Christian. I'm going to argue exactly the other side of the point that I was just making. So in your piece, you say all the Christian imagery and objects present at the Capitol insurrection suggested another cultural trend. And I'll read the rest of that paragraph. But what occurs to me is that for some of the most awful moments and some of the most awful events that have happened with a justification and symbols, where religious symbols have been hijacked by things that are really irreligious, if you will. You say crosses, Christian flags, Bibles, and signs equating President Trump and Jesus, along with the presence of Confederate flags and anti-Semitic slogans, exposed to the quote-unquote comfortable juxtaposition of Christian and white nationalist imagery. This is quoting Robert P. Jones, the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. So I'm curious if either in your other research or for any of us in our own Bible studies or churches, what sense you got from others in your church or others that you spoke to. How did they feel about the use of Christian symbols and the name of Christ being invoked on the floors of Congress?
You're talking about just January 6th in particular?
Yeah, in particular. Yeah. Or you can look earlier in 2020, President Trump forcibly having
clearing Lafayette Square with tear gas to go hold up a Bible in front of
your classmate, the fellow from your hometown, clearing Lafayette Square.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, this use of religious objects and imagery is to some people very disturbing. I know Dr. Jones, Robert P. Jones at PRI, is quite upset about it. He wrote a whole book about this called White Too Long. He is himself from Mississippi, a man of faith, and is appalled by what he sees as sort of white Christian nationalism springing up. And you see, the imagery is just so important. I mean, you can say, well, it's just, okay, so they just carry this stuff with them, big deal. But it's like, Confederate flags have taken on this whole meaning beyond just, related to the South and slavery. I mean, you see Confederate flags all over the place in parts of the country that weren't at all involved.
Yeah. And it's just a giant middle finger to people who look different.
In rural New York, upstate New York, you'll see people flying Confederate flags, and it's
New Jersey.
It's kind of creepy. And it's people making a statement. So, symbols really do matter. I mean, it's interesting how I didn't talk about this in my article, but you get these people will alter American flags. You get different versions of the American flag. So on the one hand, the American flag is seen as sacred in our American civic religion, but then at the same time, you get flags that have been altered to have particular meanings. And I can't even give you any specifics on this, but so it's.
Well, I can give you an illustration of that. Daniel, I'm in I read through the Bible and I'm in Daniel right now. Daniel 3 is it's a quagmire of a chapter for me. But as I was reading it this time, it reminded me of something that's happened here in recent years in the United States. The chapter is about three Israelites plus Daniel. So Daniel with his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Mhm.
And they refused to observe this national act of worship and respect in front of a symbol of the nation, this deified almost symbol, if not fully deified symbol of the nation. In this case, it was this huge golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar. I think many of us have vested certain symbols of the United States with this, religious significance, the flag and its sanctity. And when there were football players who chose not to observe a particular act, we can call it an act of worship or just a ritual, a national ritual. They weren't quite thrown into a fiery pit, but boy, oh boy, if Donald Trump had his druthers, I think he might have chosen to do so.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. And Jessica, when I wrote an article within Donald Trump's first year in office, and I interviewed a bunch of the foreign correspondents at the White House to get their take. And one of them just was struck by how much Americans worship the American flag in a way that, say, Europeans don't worship their national flags. And he thought it was really strange and kind of unpleasant in some ways. How, when our national anthem comes on, how we all are, very solemn, and some people put their hand on their heart. And I just thought, well, it just never occurred to me that other people in other countries just aren't like that. But Americans, we really do have a civic religion around the flag and the founding fathers, the founding documents. Yeah. And this is, and the atheists.
Part of what I think, not to, defend it, but I think one of the reasons is we're really built on an idea. We're not built on a national or a cultural sense of identity. We didn't have philosophers, we had founders. And so, the French, for example, that's who I have a lot of experience with. They don't worship the flag, although it's the tricolore. They worship they revere rather than worship their philosophers, and the Camus and the like, and some of their political philosophers too. But and certainly the Chinese revere, and the Russians revere their flag and then stand for their anthem and things. But yeah, it's interesting. My mother was a teacher in the Mennonite school system for a very long time.
Oh.
Of course, they're pacifists, and they argue that they are not citizens of any country, but they are citizens of the world. And so after September 11th, well, first of all, they never pledge a flag in a school. And after September 11th, they're all pacifists. So they didn't like that there was flags everywhere, and there was a national push and a national conversation. And almost, you really, at that time, you weren't ready to say that was a bad idea to go to Afghanistan, because we felt so attacked and so vulnerable that, it just, a lot of citizens were just, yeah, let's go get them, But being in that context as a non-Mennonite was very hard for her, because I just remember her talking about being at conferences that were talking about the government decisions that they didn't agree with, and so there's a lot of dissonance. I guess that's an interesting observation about the civic religion.
But of course, Europeans are so non-religious.
I think that's part of it.
They don't go to church. I mean, the Notre Dame is this incredible building. It's a church, but it's revered. And when it burned, it was just profoundly traumatic for the French people and for the world. But, what percentage of French people actually go to church every week? Not that many.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about, and that I'm fascinated by, is religion in our politics, and how much of an intertwining there is. And you must have had some concept of that as you wrote this article, Linda. But yet you do refuse to connect the decrease of religious belief in the country with the increase in political polarization. And I think you gave some reasons for that. But one thing you said was this concept of the God-sized hole. And I just keep coming back to that, because I do think there it make the argument that there is something in all of us that wants to be connected to something bigger, something more holy or righteous, if you will, whether it's a cause or a being. I think there is an innate part of humanity that wants that. And these, while Burgess makes the argument that religion won't, politics isn't what you're going to talk about at a birth or a death. Basically, it's not going to carry you in a transcendent nature through hard times. There is a high there, and there is a connection there to righting wrongs, to winning races, to the sort of competition. What are your thoughts on why America in particular is has traditionally been so motivated religiously in its politics?
I mean, America was founded as a religious refuge, right? I mean, religion is in our founding, and it's in our Constitution. The freedom of religion and the freedom from religion, right? So we don't have a state religion. I mean, as I said, I'm not a religious historian at all. I know that some individual states did have religious identities. Some were Catholic, I know. So America that religion is very much a founding of this country, but it's a very protected and sort of cabined off from the hand of government, which is important. So, in Europe, my understanding is that the government was much more tied to the church directly, and that kind of wrecked it in some ways, I think. That it's really better for religious institutions to be protected from the government and vice versa. But in terms of sort of religion and its role in politics, I mean, it really is. This is how I came into this topic as a reporter, was covering the so-called religious right or Christian conservatives. I mean, back in the day, the fight against abortion, I've written about that battle for decades, and now it's come roaring back with the Supreme Court taking that case.
Right.
But, it used to be that evangelical churches steered clear of politics completely. That was seen as not their purview, that they're all about practicing their faith and avoiding getting involved in politics. And over time that changed. Now I talked to Tony Perkins, who is a
Family Research Council.
Right, Family Research Council. I've known Tony for decades. He and Gary Bauer have been leaders of the so-called religious right for a long time, more mainstream. Tony did not support what happened on January 6th. And he wanted to make very clear the distinction between the people who would illegally break into the US Capitol and with apparent intent to do terrible things to people. I mean, crying out for where's Nancy Pelosi, where's Mike Pence? Lord knows what they would have done if they'd found them. That's not what your kind of mainstream, evangelical Christian activists are about, really. January 6th was really a fringe activity. There was a lot of QAnon activism there, and some people view QAnon as a kind of almost a quasi-religious cult in the way that people believe.
There's a messianic figure.
Yeah. Yeah.
You raised January 6th, and we kind of keep coming back to that because you also start the piece with a character whose experience of January 6th is very different than the video that we've seen. She acknowledges that there were horrible and violent things that happened there, but the way that you handled her story, I really felt showed a lot of respect that we don't see. First of all, we don't see that perspective talked about very often, about that there were people there. And I understand there were 4 different groups, some of whom were just there to pray at the Capitol, that you really treated her with respect and humanity. And I found that kind of shockingly unbiased and shockingly human, because it's so that day and its meaning in our American psyche is just so charged. How difficult was it to treat her with that sort of respect and to kind of take her narrative seriously as being legitimate when we did see so many narratives that weren't peaceful? that
Right,
day.
exactly. No, I mean, I talked to her. I found her through somebody who themselves believes the QAnon conspiracy theory. And in arranging that conversation with the woman I called Mandy, I gave her my solemn vow that I would not reveal who she was, and that I would respect her right to believe whatever she wants to believe, and that she would feel heard. I think everybody deserves that sort of level of human decency. And so in telling and allowing her to say what she believed and what she says she saw, I did have one reader, a friend of mine, who was upset that I let her say that without pushing back really hard.
Yeah. Because she called it the most patriotic day of her life. And that's an extraordinary statement.
Well, it is. And it was, she's somebody who I just let her talk, and her talking about her participation in that day struck me as quasi-religious. Not that she had some kind of ecstatic experience, but that she was there as I called it, a moment of secular communion. She was with like-minded people, which is what going to church is about. There's sort of this unspoken pact almost with the people who are with you, that you all love each other and care about each other and all want the same thing. And I'm just letting her have that. I mean, she participated in something that a whole lot of people think was profoundly wrong. But she said to me that when she entered the Capitol, the door was wide open. The Capitol police officer welcomed her. She said, if somebody had told me not to go in, I would absolutely not have gone in there. So when she saw the reporting of what other people said happened that day, she was really shocked. She just didn't know. I mean, it's like being at any event, you see what you see, and that's your truth. That's your reality. Yeah. And she didn't say, she says, yeah, I saw the videos of what happened on January 6th. And she's like, that's not what I saw. That wasn't my experience. So, yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe she was making it all up. She sounded completely genuine to me. I didn't meet with her in person. I talked to her on the phone. So it is what it is. I mean, there's a lot of people who thought they were doing good by going to the Capitol, by going to hear Donald Trump speak on January 6th and then marching to the Capitol. Yeah. And what they felt was stopping the steal. These are people who believe that. And it wasn't my place to try to talk her out of that well,
I think it's important for people to read that perspective is out there. And, right. And she's not the only one, I suspect, that has it.
There's a lot of people who feel that way. A lot of Republicans who feel that Donald Trump was the rightful winner of the election and that the election was stolen. And no amount of badgering and pushing back and saying nasty things to somebody is going to change their mind.
Yeah.
I heard Bill Cassidy say that there are ways to talk to your friends and your family that believe the big lie, as it's being referred to, that are more productive, and there's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, some folks are just not going to be moved. There's such a narrative and a construct around their ability or willingness to see, facts for what they are. But two points that Senator Cassidy made was one, that he found to be effective in talking to some of his more ardent Trump supporting constituents, family and friends. One is, when Rudy Giuliani was under oath, he admitted that there was no fraud, that that there wasn't anything that they could pursue. That's when he, and then he went out in front of the cameras and said, stop the steal. The other one was Sidney
Powell.
Sidney Powell, thank you. Same thing. When she was under oath and had to actually testify. She said, well, no reasonable person would actually believe this stuff, but I thought it was a really good point that I think his overall point, he used a couple of these facts of folks that are heroes of this particular movement, if you want to call it Stop the Steal. But his overall point was, listen, folks that tend to be more liberal, progressive, Democrats, may think one way. Folks that tend to be more conservative, or in particular Trump supporting conservatives, may think another way. Part of what's going to help us speak the same language is actually by listening to each other,
right.
and continuing to beat each other over the head, whether it's rhetorically beating each other over the head or actually beating each other over the head. That's going to be less effective. It's only going to raise the temperature, Some of the endeavors that you're involved with are really encouraging for that very reason, because it creates environments for folks from very different perspectives to be heard and to listen to each other, to actively listen to each other. So,
yeah. Let me bring up the Respect Project, which the Christian Science Monitor, I think, has just recently launched. This is an effort to write a series of articles that encourage respect. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the project, what you know about it, how long it's going to go on, how it serves a purpose for sort of, it seems to me, from what you've described the mission to be at the Monitor, that it's very much in line with that.
Right, exactly. I mean, the news business is largely focused on negativity. A lot of it is, right? Bad news, plane crashes, pandemic, economic strife. I mean, people suffering. That usually, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
Yeah.
And at the Monitor, we try to look at things a little bit differently. Look at efforts to solve problems. There's a lot of people out there trying to do good and trying to bridge divides. Whether it's in the Middle East or on a Canadian TV show called The Political Blind Date, which I love, where you just get people on opposite sides of the political aisle who discover that they do have a lot in common and can feel empathy toward each other. That was one of the articles. So this is it's sort of showing the way for people at a time of great division, especially there are forces that have exacerbated these divisions. I think social media, there's a lot of great stuff about social media. I mean, I can post my articles and Jessica Stone can see that I wrote this big giant story about is politics the new religion, and here I am. So I love Facebook in some ways, and then in other ways, Twitter can be just awful, or people saying terrible things, or people. I mean, it's just way too easy to go on these platforms and just start mouthing off, and then next thing you know, you've been fired. But that's so at the Monitor, we're trying to kind of, they call it show the humanity behind the headlines and not just dwell on the negative and not make people feel drained and hopeless, but kind of show the way for constructive efforts to solve problems, basically. And it might, at this point, people have been so much at each other's throats that even just getting people to sit down and have a civil conversation can be a victory.
Yeah. I saw another one of the articles in that series was two Janets from two different sides of the country, one red Janet, one blue Janet. And I didn't get to finish it yet, but I mean, it's, I think that project, especially for people that like to listen to our podcast, it's definitely something you want to look into and subscribe to, because there's just a lot of good storytelling there. And Linda didn't tell me to say any of this, but I really felt like I responded to the message. Maybe that I should have. This is my jam too. But I think it's worth everybody giving it a closer look and subscribing so that you can get access to those articles. How long is that project? Do you have any idea how long that's going to go on, Linda?
I think I should know this. I think the 6 articles in the series have already gone up, and they did a big web event recently, which is available online. If you go to the Respect Project page at csmonitor.com, you can, there's a permanent link to that web event. And I think they had about 1,000 people were
Oh,
watching
wow.
on the web. Yes, it wasn't an in-person event. It was on the web. But
Yeah. No, I started listening to it, and really remarkable in terms of the people they pulled in from around the world and the things
Right.
that they're seeing, which is another quasi parallel here. When I wrote Crossing the Divide, I didn't ever foresee a time where for whatever reason, I was thinking crossing international divides, not crossing divides within our own country. And it was published in March, but some people knew I was writing it, and I started getting approached right after January 6th to just talk about it sort of being the same skill set. And that sort of comes back to your toolkit that you started as a reporter in Moscow. And I just think, that sort of does take a little bit of an outside broad lens sometimes to find some of the most simple answers with respect to this, not to get so far into the political weeds of the things that divide us, to not be able to see all the things that are the same.
Yeah, no, it's true. And, another thing I've been involved in is something called the Dartmouth Conference, which is, I don't do that. I sort of do that as me. I'm not doing that as
Not
as
the Linda Feldmann.
as, the White House correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. So I participate on their ground rules, Chatham House rules. So if I want to, I've written a bunch of articles about it because it's just super interesting. And the whole idea, it's track 2 diplomacy. So it's retired diplomats, it's retired politicians, it's academics, retired ambassadors, brainstorming the very, very serious issues in US-Russian relations and brainstorming solutions, and then presenting them to the respective governments. And one of the concerns is over nuclear weapons. And as the last time we met, which was in December of 2019, the New START treaty, which was the last remaining arms control agreement, the clock was ticking. That would have expired in February of this year if President Biden and President Putin hadn't agreed to extend for 5 years. So the idea was that you could just extend it, just sign it and extend it without changing anything. And the Dartmouth Conference felt very strongly that was a positive step to take, that strategic stability is incredibly important in US-Russian relations. And I will say, and I just draw this connection, but with the Russians, I've spent a lot of time in Russia over the years. Starting in 1980, I was a student over there. The Russians, almost more than anything else, want respect. They want us to respect their humanity, their history, their culture, and almost more than anything right now is the losses that they suffered in World War II. I mean, a lot of American soldiers died in World War II, but we weren't fighting World War II on our soil. Yeah. Millions and millions of people died over there. And Americans, now World War II, the veterans are quickly leaving us as they move through their 90s if they haven't already passed away. But over there, whenever you're there on any kind of anniversary day, celebrating World War II, the victories, it's so powerful for them. Even people my age who weren't alive during World War II, it's part of their family culture in a way that it just isn't here. And so understanding their concerns about their borders, their boundaries, their Russian identity. They're so proud of their identity. And so when the United States, when the Soviet Union fell apart, that was a moment of great humiliation for them. And just to understand that, I think goes a long way toward, you don't have to agree with everything they say, but if you just listen to them and understand what they're saying, it goes a long way toward, reaching some kind of, ability to live together and occupy the planet together.
I have to just point out there's a lot of parallels between that and and the Chinese as well, because that's something I've learned about. Americans don't learn about the losses that the Russians and the Chinese suffered. We were actually on the same side of that war, and then went on to make peace with the Japanese and all. People just don't really realize how many people gave their lives for that win that we really don't have strong relationships with anymore, as we're not allies.
Exactly.
It's really remarkable.
To your point, and to tie some of these strings together, as you mentioned, you have written numerous stories over the years about your contributions to the Dartmouth Conference. In a 2017 piece, you kicked the piece off by saying, U.S.-Russia ties may be at their worst in decades, but a meeting of citizen diplomats, I love that phrase, a meeting of citizen diplomats from both countries highlighted the value of face-to-face conversations and listening. So one last question and a couple pieces of business. I'm curious if you think something like this is more difficult with U.S. and Russian citizens, or between Trump and non-Trump or conservative and, here domestically.
I think it's harder with Trump, the pro-Trump versus anti-Trump crowd. I mean, there are parallels. I mean, there is an effort to demonize and dehumanize the quote other side, to call them the enemy, to wish the other side ill, to think the worst of them, to think they're stupid and that they're just out to get you. And it's a really toxic mindset that just leads to no good. So I'm hopeful that as we move out the other side of the pandemic and we resume some kind of version of normal life, that people can calm down a little bit and get to know each other as people again, and be civil, and just recognize that people have the right to believe whatever they want to believe, whether it's political or religious.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. And I think there are some remedies that are coming into being. It's not a coincidence. There are projects that there are numerous projects across the country that are attempting to, number one, diagnose a lot of the societal ills, as well as introduce some prescriptions for them. And I think of the Dartmouth Conference and some of the other endeavors that we discussed today are part of that, is acknowledging and diagnosing what some of the problems are, introducing some prescriptions, some of what we talked about today, simply talking to your neighbors, because there's a human being. My neighbor that we see each other on our walk every morning, Pietro, he's originally from Italy. I went over for dinner one night, and Fox News and Trump was all over the place, but to me, he's just Pete. Like, we probably vote very differently. Although I don't know, I tend to vote conservative, but I'm just not a big Trump fan, as you could probably tell. But he's just Pierino. He's my pal. He's a human being, and his wife is wonderful. And so we can fall very differently on the different Trump side of the spectrum, but he's still my buddy, and Bella, his dog, is a friendly dog, and so we humanize each other. And then creating these forums, like the Dartmouth Conference, for people to come together, or what Jessica referred to, the Respect Project, or the Franklin Project. Anyway, that's a whole other series of podcasts, let alone for this conversation. Did you have any questions for us?
So I wondered if the subject of your podcast is so specific, if you have a hard time getting guests, but I'm going to guess not. I'm going to guess that it's such a rich subject matter that you can pretty much dig it out of anybody. But I'm curious if you have a hard time getting people to talk about it. And I ask you that because I actually did have a hard time getting people to talk about their personal take on politics potentially as a form of religion. Some people absolutely did not want to talk about it.
Well, we entered into it. I don't know what your experience is yet, Jess, but I've been doing it now for about 6 months. And we went into it specifically for that reason. Well, you're not supposed to talk about politics. You're not supposed to talk about religion. No. We are supposed to talk about it. And we're under that impression because a lot of the screamers have taken up space in the public square. Well, I want to take some of that space back, and listen, sometimes we'll get someone on that wants to stick to the politics lane, and sometimes we'll get somebody on that wants to stick to the religion lane or the theology lane, and that's fine. We'll respect that. And oftentimes we the intersection is the most fun for me and most fruitful for me.
Yeah.
I think we just have to reclaim some of that space.
I've never understood why we don't talk about these two. What, when we refer to the third rails of politics, why are they why is religion the third rail of politics? It shouldn't be the third rail of anything. Like it shouldn't have been taken out of diplomacy. Like, I'm very passionate about bringing it back into diplomacy as a way to connect with people across cultures. I just, we missed 9/11 in a large part because we didn't understand the radicalization going on in mosques. Now we could be missing domestic extremism if we're not more careful about watching the radicalization that's happening in today's evangelical churches. And I don't want to miss that. And I don't want anybody that listens to miss that, because this is our country. We should, we're going to have to go about it, investigating it differently than investigating another country. But man, you can't just discount it. We were talking to Elizabeth Newman, and she just has her finger on this fascinating intersection about what's going on and trying to be part of the solution to point it out as a person of faith herself. So, you have a certain, it's a very rich lane. And, as you know, until you read my book, you didn't know my whole story, Linda, but I do think that having the ability to talk or not talk about it, but not just be afraid to talk about it or be uncertain how to talk about it, it makes you better at asking questions and understanding people. It's fundamental to our humanity.
One of the things that really, there's a lot that helped me in my dad's conversations, turn down the heat a little bit on me and my dad's conversations. And one of them was when I became comfortable saying, that's a really great question. And I don't know, can I get back to you on that? And we've been in this 20 plus year dialogue after I became a Christian. As you can imagine, it was a traumatic experience for both of us. And it just sparked this conversation that was at first, thank God there was a conversation at all. At first, it looked like there wasn't going to be. But one of those things was, I don't know. I got to think about that. I got to read about that. And then we circled back around about it over a whiskey around a fire pit, So
we need more of that. We need exactly more of that. Down to the whiskey in the fire pit.
The fire pits definitely became a thing during the pandemic, right? Everybody hanging out outside because I couldn't hang out inside. So
yeah.
Well, we've had, I got to know, I'm sure you did too, your neighbors or the people in your community on a new level, and had some of those same conversations. It's really important. So any other questions for us, Miss Investigator?
I think you guys are great. I can't think of anything. I can now see that you probably have an infinite quantity of people you could talk to.
Well, let us know if there's anybody we should talk to that you're talking to, because I'm definitely plumbing your articles for some good ideas.
Sure. No, I
some good voices in there.
Yeah, no, I can give you some ideas. I think the whole Jewish thing is interesting, just because being Judaism is a faith, but it's also an ethnicity. And I've always been aware of that, but I'm still kind of trying to understand how that works. How
some people would argue that point, actually, and especially when you change your faith, like Corey did.
Yeah.
You have to fight to be marked still part of the ethnicity when you change your religion within Jewish culture.
Yeah, no, I've had folks be pretty obnoxious about it at times. Like, you're not a Jew, you accept Jesus. And I'm like, I'm still, this is a really blunt way to put
Jesus
it, but
was Jewish.
What's that?
Yep.
Jesus was Jewish.
Jesus was
right?
Jewish. The more blunt way of putting it is, God forbid a Hitler came back, I'm still Jewish enough to kill. So
yeah, that's usually what I say too.
I'm still very
terrible.
I'm still very plugged in. Every year we have our Seder, the kids, the kids are more drawn to Judaism because it's part of our family. It's part of our heritage. It's part of what brings us together. The Hanukkah candles and, the Purim carnival and we weren't just those once a year Jews, we were.
So you still do all that?
We still do a lot of it. Obviously not as much as when I was a kid and we kept kosher and we did, we were the whole Gantz Megillah, if you will. But no, my kids, especially with my parents being out here, they're here for 6 months out of the year. And when they're here, especially those holidays, that's why I say Purim and Passover, and sometimes you go over Shabbos. So we still, because again, it's something that it's really a rich experience, because we just had a Zoom family reunion. There were about 50 or 60 people on it, because March 3rd was the 100-year anniversary of when the boat arrived at Ellis Island. My grandmother was on the boat, and her parents and grandparents were on the boat. Just knowing that my grandmother and my great grandmother, who I was named after, and her parents, who I now know a lot more about, were doing those same things on Friday night. There's something that really connects me to the Nathans and the Blicks, and knowing the language, and more about Cherny Ostrov near the Black Sea. So anyway, sorry. That's, like I said, I tend to go off on these rabbit trails.
No, but I mean, I was raised with the prominent Jewish holidays, not the high holy days. And we do Passover and Hanukkah with our kids, because there is a sense of, at the end of the Seder, you say next year in Jerusalem. And there is just something so complete about understanding that you're doing that, and every Jewish person around the world is doing that at not at the same time, but the same day.
It connects you. I have family in Israel, and I knew that they were making Shabbos when we were making Shabbos, or making Passover when there is something that connects us very viscerally and in a tactile way. So how can we find you? How can we find your work, and how can we find you on social and all that good stuff?
So my articles are in the Christian Science Monitor, which is csmonitor.com. I'm on Twitter. It's Linda_Feldmann, and Feldman has 2 N's. I'm not a big tweeter. Twitter kind of scares me. I compose my tweet, and then I stare at it for a while, and then I either delete it or push send. More comfortable on Facebook, but yeah, I'm here in Washington. People of goodwill are welcome to reach out to me and ask me questions, or give me story ideas, give me hot tips.
Terrific.
Especially the hot tips.
Yeah.
Well, I might be taking you up on that. I'm overdue for a trip to DC. I promised Jessica I'd be taking her and her hubby out to dinner, and maybe you'll come along, and we'll pick up the conversation.
Pied Piper Trail, Core. By the time you get out here, you're gonna have a lot of friends. It's gonna be might need a monitor breakfast. We might need a moderator.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. That'd be a lot of fun. Well, Linda Feldmann, it was such a joy to hang out with you for a bit here, and dive a little bit deeper into that great story and more about your own background. And I hope this isn't the last time that we get to hang out.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
All right. See you, Jess. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us today. If you appreciate what you've heard here, please go to iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. That really helps move us up the chart so others can find out what we're up to here. For Ronnie Nathan, I'm Corey Nathan, and we've been talking politics and religion without killing each other. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.